Please rise and join me in the Pledge of Allegiance. I pledge allegiance to the flag of the United States of America and to the republic for which it stands, one nation, under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Good evening, everyone. This is the regularly scheduled meeting of the BET for April 2010. Normally at this time, any unfortunate or otherwise deaths of BET members are usually recognized at this time. But I would ask for all of you to stand and join me in a moment of silence for what I consider to be a true historian of the town, a true person who loved the town in Bernie Udane, and I think a testament to him was the number of people who attended his service, politicians and BET members alike. So if you all join me in a moment of silence for our friend Bernie Udane. Thank you. I certainly will miss his columns, especially those relating to the BET. The first item to come before us under item 2, non-routine applications, PS2, parking services. Mr. Mason.
Yes, good evening. PS2, parking service, this is a transfer for $25,000 under their account code equipment rental, and I so move it on behalf of the Budget Committee.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Simon. You should have all received an updated blue sheet in your packet, which is one of the reasons why this was placed on the non-routine item. Mr. Mason, comment?
If I could, I'd like to, the idea behind this transfer is the parking fund needs to take money from their 100 major object code and 400 major object code and transfer it in their 200 major object code, and that gets journal vouchered over to DBW for the snow removal of the lots during the year. And with items like this that we routinely have, we have account lines, and one of the things that when it came to the Budget Committee, obviously there needed to be some clarification on that. And one of the things we encourage all the department heads to do is to, when they're coming for this, is the purpose of monitoring the transfers is obviously so we can build better budgets in the future. So that's part of the equation here. But we did vote 4-0 to move it to the BET for approval tonight. Thank you.
Further discussion on this item? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 12-0-0. Mr. Pellegrino, the routine application.
I wish to move the following routine application, PR4, Parks and Recreation. They wish to transfer $22,150 for professional services.
It's been moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Mason. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. 12-0-0. Item 3 now comes before us, the assessor's report. Mr. Gortney, our town assessor, along with Bob Shipman, our assistant town assessor. Good evening.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman and members of the board. You have my report tonight, which is quite large because it includes a copy of the contract for the revaluation. Just in summary, quickly, we have processed the Board of Assessment appeal hearings, and we're collecting the elderly applications. They have until the 15th of May, and we're in the process of reviewing the market modeling for the revaluation. I'll be glad to answer any questions that you have.
One of the things that we've asked the assessor to do is on a go-forward basis to start reporting specifically on the reval. We have a two-member team who meets with you at least on a monthly basis, sometimes even more than that. And as the reval approaches, I think it's important that not only we discuss the progress of it, but it's important for the public to understand where we are in the process and serve as both an educational presentation as well as question and answer for the BET. So one of the items or one of the discussion points already this month was sort of where we are and if there was going to be a decision to hold off on the reval this year, what would that do to your timing for the reval this year, and where are some pitfalls in making that decision? And so maybe you can walk us through just what your current thinking is relative to performing the reval this year as opposed to putting it off another year, and what that would do.
First, in terms of progress, the revaluation company has nearly completed the commercial review of properties. They're in the final phases of doing the preliminary work on the commercial properties, to be followed by some adjustments at the end of the cycle. They'll be beginning at the end of this month with the residential review work. We're in the final process of reviewing the residential models at this time. In terms of the completion, we expect that there'll be no problem with completing the revaluation on time for its October 1st deadline. In terms of if it were decided for it to be postponed for a year, it's going to require that we would have to create a new grand list for 2010 that's different than the one we're working on. What we're working on right now is a revaluation grand list, and we would have to go back to the old list and add on the new construction during the year and bring the records up to date. So would need to make that decision in the early summer if it's decided to postpone it for any reason.
And if you could share with the full BET, though, your comments about, at least at this point, what your decision or recommendation would be as to whether or not we should complete it this year versus holding it off another year.
My recommendation is to complete it this year. We should have no problem with coming up with the valid revaluation numbers, and I think that it would be best. We fortunately have, I think, a more stable period right now, where I think the public is beginning to see some stability in the market. Everything seems to be favorable towards completing the revaluation this year, and I think that would be my recommendation that we continue on and complete it and get the notices out to the public this year.
So as a BET, we'll be following this, and the expectation is that every month we'll spend 5 minutes on this topic alone just to make sure we know where you are and what your current thinking is.
Okay.
Further questions for the assessor? Is there an approval to accept the assessor's report?
So, second.
Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Pellegrino. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention. Is there a motion to take an item out of order? The valuation contract?
So moved.
Second.
Moved by Mr. Mason, second by Mr. Pellegrino to take up the, under old business, the municipal revaluation service contract. All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstentions, 12-0-0. The contract is now before us. You should have all received a copy of the contract, which is, I think, something that Ms. Barton and I tried to avoid, but went on anyway, so we'll figure about that miscommunication. But in any event, if you've either read the contract and or the email that Ms. Barton said regarding the review of this contract has been reviewed by the law committee and by the team that reviews the assessor's department. With that, Ms. Barton, do you have anything to add to this discussion?
I can just point out briefly, the purpose of this new revaluation contract is to change revaluation companies, which is not as dramatic as it sounds. We are following the appraiser that we have used in the past to his new company, with many of the staff members that have worked on the town's revaluation for at least 2 and possibly 3 revaluations. So it's in some ways more of a technical change than a substantive change, but we took the opportunity to update the contract, clean up some of the language from the earlier contract, make the dates conform to where we are precisely now, since some things are further ahead and some things are a little behind. They vary. And I've reviewed this with the law department, with Ted, and the committees that you mentioned have reviewed it, and so I would strongly recommend that we approve it tonight.
Is there further discussion? Can I have a motion to get this in front of us then? Moved by Ms. Barton, second by Mr. Norton. Further discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention, 12-0-0. So Ted, go ahead and execute this contract. I would say contact the law department just to make sure the i's have been dotted and t's crossed on it. Okay, thank you. Item 4 now comes before us, BET committees and special project team reports. You should have received copies of many, if not all, of these reports. I had a question on the Nathaniel Witherell Building Committee report. And this will, to some degree, fall in line with the preliminary discussion under old business for Project Renew. But to Mr. Pellegrino, I note in the report, the Building Committee report, that there's contingency for approximately 1.3 construction contingency, approximately 800,000 for design contingency, and then another owner's contingency of 2.8 million. And while I have no notion about whether or not those are correct numbers or not, I do recall my service on the Hamilton Avenue Building Committee where our contingency was too low. And I know during that discussion that there are benchmarks for in this industry for renovations or for new buildings. And so I would just ask that further information be provided relative to this item number 4 before our next meeting relative to where that fits relative to benchmarks, and if we're outside of the benchmarks, why we would be outside of those benchmarks.
Okay. And we'll certainly provide that information to the board.
Are there other discussion points on any of the other committee reports that have been provided?
We have the MISA report.
That's right, you should have also received the MISA report and the investment advisory report. Mr. Pellegrino.
Yes, I'd like to take one moment and highlight 2 facts that were in Ms. Tarkington's Nathaniel Witherell liaison report. The first fact is that for the first 8 months, ending February 28th of this fiscal year, the Nathaniel Witherell actually experienced an operating gain of $157,394. That compares to what was a budgeted loss expectation of $65,668 for a positive variance of $223,062. If the balance of the year continues with this trend, it will be 3 years in a row that Nathaniel Witherell will have operated in the black, and I think that's an important fact to have out and on the record in light of the fact that we are discussing Project Renew. I think the second point that I came across here that bears being addressed is the admissions. There's a question often as to whether or not it's Greenwich residents that avail themselves of Nathaniel Witherell. For this fiscal year 2010, the short-term admissions is 77% Greenwich residents, long-term 66% Greenwich residents, and I think it would be my understanding that if you look at census, and if you look at not just current residents, but those affiliated with Greenwich at some point in time, that those numbers would be actually even higher. I think that's very important to get on the record so that people know that it is a facility used predominantly by Greenwich residents. Thank you.
Further discussion on either those 2 reports or any others? I have a question for the Audit Committee. They're meeting April 8th. Mr. Norton, on the second page, 3rd paragraph from the bottom, you talk about that the Law Department recommended a public hearing to discuss a proposal on marine vendor commercial service license permit. is the request that the BET hold that public hearing or some other entity? It was unclear to me.
It's my understanding it's being requested of the Selectman's office.
Okay. And then 2 paragraphs above that discuss the CDL review, license review.
Yes.
So are we doing this now as a matter of protocol to review periodically CDL licenses, or those individuals who hold CDL licenses who drive vehicles for the town?
We will be as soon as we have the information. And in the process of going through this, it was discovered that there's a U.S. Department of Transportation requirement for us to do it on a periodic basis, which I believe is biennial, every other year.
Thank you. Mr. Simon, you said you had a question on the audit committee report?
No, and another report
Okay. Any other on the audit committee report? If not, we'll move on.
to the MISA report.
Visa report.
There are multiple meetings tomorrow on MISA. There's a meeting today. When was the MISA, was there a MISA meeting recently?
Yes, April 6th, there was a meeting. There's a meeting tomorrow at 7:30, April 20th. We had a meeting with the neighbors last Friday where we had a presentation of the new lights that would go with the new addition to the high school. We also discussed the landscaping that would go there. We had the landscape architect with us. And there was a group of neighbors who were present, who listened, who were very pleased with what they heard with respect to the lighting and the landscaping. We are having another meeting with the neighbors immediately after our meeting tomorrow morning. So we're going to meet from 7:30 to 9, and then I believe we're meeting with the neighbors at 10 o'clock again, the neighbors who were away at the time, so they could see the landscaping and the lighting. But they've been provided that information. I guess I could go into detail. We're supposed to present to planning and zoning tomorrow for preliminary site plan approval. And I received a call just before this meeting that there may be some problem that I don't want to go into publicly. There will not be, we may have to make some changes, nothing to do with the committee, but has to do with some protocol. So I don't want to be obtuse, but I don't want to make any representations that I don't know officially right now on the record. But otherwise, the project is going along swimmingly, so we'll see what happens. We have received inland wetlands approval. That was a big part of it. So that's where we are. I'll report more at the next meeting, because we'll have a meeting tomorrow as well as early May. So.
Further questions on this committee? Bill, on when going before planning and zoning, is the building committee also seeking municipal improvement?
Yes,
Okay, so it's not only preliminary site plan approval, it's municipal improvement?
right, and that's where there may be an issue
Got it, okay.
that we have to discuss.
And we hadn't even talked about it, so that's,
Yes.
okay. Further follow-up to any other committee, either meeting minutes or otherwise? Okay. Item 5 now comes before us. I should mention before we get to item 5, that the revised agenda did go out today, which took off from the routine applications Project Renew. Technically, we're still working off of the old agenda because it was not within the 24-hour period to have the new posting be effective. But I wanted to make sure everybody was on the same page in terms of the fact that we were not going to take up Project Renew as an item this month. That was discussed at the Budget Committee meeting. And so we will still discuss it under old business for a preliminary discussion on Project Renew. But just so that everybody is clear, we did skip over that because we will not be taking that item up, and we expect to take it up in May pending some other issues that may arise. So with that, item 5 now comes before us, the Comptroller's report.
Good evening, Mr. Chairman, BET members. Couple of items. Draw your attention to page 1. The RFP for consultant services for the Town and Board of Education Shared Service is moving along. We had a kickoff meeting April 5th with a number of BET members, the Town and Board of Education officials. We had the project embarked, and there was a series of interviews between Matrix Consultant, the town, and the Board of Education the week of the 5th, the 12th, and they're going to end up this week of the 19th. They're going to produce a preliminary report, which they call a descriptive profile. It's going to be kicked back to the steering committee and those that were interviewed to assure the accuracy of it. It's similar to when an auditor does an audit and puts it in draft form. They'll send it back for accuracy just to make sure that they're on the same page. Subsequent to that, the week of the 26th, they'll start working on analytical reports. And the goal is to have a finished draft report, a presentation for the BET in the month of June, and we have a fallback date the month of July for the July 19th BET meeting. So everything is going smoothly so far, and hopefully we can be done with this report for June and July. Before I move on, any questions on the shared services report?
Just so that everybody knows, looking at it, the BET schedule, it may be that because of our own schedule, we will push this to July, but we're still looking at that, and in the hopes that, at the very least, Matrix is done with it for presentation in June, and then if we have to push it off, we can do that.
Mr. Chair,
Mr. Norton?
the June date is very tight for them to complete. Based upon the original presentation that they made, that they would be completing it the week before in draft form, and whether or not we could have it in time to review for the June meeting is questionable.
Okay, well, so either way, I mean, we'll be monitoring this, and we'll let you know, but thank you for that information.
Second topic is the Retirement Board RFP for consultant services, the long-standing RFP that's in the home stretch. It's been going on for quite a while. We've got it down to 4 respondents, finalists. We're going to be interviewing the 4 finalists during we haven't settled it on. It's going to be the second or third week of May. There are going to be 2-hour interviews, times 4 is 8 hours. We haven't decided yet because of commitments from the Retirement Board interviewers. So the goal is to get, hopefully, a decision for the month of June. And obviously, the process is only starting once the Retirement Board selects a consultant. You've got the contractual process that has to go through the law department. Now, if you make the assumption that there would be a change, regardless of whether it's the incumbent or there's a change, you do have a template for a contract. So hopefully that can go through the process very quickly. We would like to try to get it to you in the summertime, either way. So any questions on the Retirement Board RFP?
Mr. Norton?
Yes, where is Wilshire Associates Incorporated? Are they California
Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania is the home office.
home office? And will they be serviced out of Pittsburgh, or will they be serviced out of a more local office?
I believe they would be, don't know the answer to that. I know the answer to the other 3. I couldn't find in the RFP a home office that was close to here as far as the servicing the client. Third topic is I sat down at length Friday with Franklin Company. We're doing the application for the insurance renewals for June 30th to July 1st. The market is still soft. Last year we had a very favorable renewal, and it looks like at worst we should be at least break even or under budget. So any questions on the Comptroller's report on any other topics?
Questions for the Comptroller? Peter, I have just a question on the Retirement Board. So I heard, if I understood you correctly, that'll come to us sometime in the summer months to approve that contract? That's anticipated at this point?
Yes.
Okay. In selecting the 4 firms, my understanding is there were a variety of firms that answered the RFP, and some that potentially either went under the current construct of how we manage our funds, and some in a different type of construct, i.e. that they manage the funds in a different manner.
Okay.
Was there any discussion by the Retirement Board relative to the manner in which we have our funds invested and therefore have a mix of the different types of consultants, or did the four that were selected all seem to manage the fund in the same way?
Okay, the answer is no. It was done quantitatively. We're not at liberty to get into detailed discussions because of the RFP process at this point. The way the process works is we rated the 10 firms, and we took the 4 highest scoring firms, and we went from there. Mr. Pellegrino was in the room. We did not get into a philosophical discussion. It was just strictly quantitative. And we did not share our thoughts. Now, I have to qualify that because Mr. Pellegrino and myself had to leave the meeting and go to another meeting that was overlapping that meeting. So,
But, just to answer that, I would assume that during the 2-hour session with each of the firms, when you're going to go through that kind of a philosophical difference as to what they think they should do versus what the board thinks should be done.
I agree.
If I may add, there is a supplemental list of questions being pulled together.
Yes.
This afternoon, I submitted 2 questions, one specifically being, what is the investment philosophy of these firms? And specifically, how do they look at passive indexes versus active management? It's certainly one of the questions that I have for them.
Okay. Other questions on the comptroller's report? Okay. Moved by Ms. Tarkington, second by Mr. Norton. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Is there a motion to approve the treasurer's report? Moved by Mr. Norton, second by Mr. Finger. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstentions? 12-0-0. 3 sets of meeting minutes. Is there a motion to approve the public hearing minutes for March 16th, 2010?
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Is there a motion to approve the BET meeting minutes for, let's see, we'll go with the regular meeting for March 18th.
So moved.
Moved by Mr. Pellegrino. Second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye.
Aye.
Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. And is there a motion to approve the BET Decision Day meeting minutes for March 18th, 2010? Moved by Mr. Pellegrino, second by Mr. Simon. Discussion? All those in favor signify by saying aye. Aye. Opposed? Abstention? 12-0-0. Okay, thank you. Officers' report. Let me first thank you, all the BET members, for attending the April RTM meetings. I think it was well received. Certainly, we got out ahead of the budget to some degree. Questions were asked, not only on the budget, but I think a little bit on Project Renew, and I think that was helpful in terms of going forward. There are assignments for May. We'll send out a reminder for the May assignments. In those instances, we're not only covering the district meetings, but we'll also be covering the standing committee meetings. The first one, I believe, is budget overview on April 29th.
And they have one tomorrow night.
And one tomorrow night. So obviously, we'd like to make sure that we are attending those meetings and answering the questions that they have for us relative to the budget. There's also been a request by our tax collector, who I must say I've had several conversations with just in terms of process, which have been helpful, so thank you. I know he's here tonight, so thank you. To see if we could move up the May RTM meeting from May 19th, which is a Monday, and it's the Monday a week after the RTM meeting, to move the BET meeting from May 19th to May 13th, which would be the preceding Thursday evening. You should note that That Monday, the 10th, is the RTM meeting. The 11th is the Budget Committee. I know on the 12th, there are some RTC, and I don't know if there's any DTC meetings that night. And so we would, or I would propose that we meet on May 13th. Now, if there's any conflict whatsoever, there is a conflict?
I'll be out of the country.
And you'll also be out on the 19th, or you'll be here?
I'll be back.
Okay, so we won't move it. It was, part of this is to try to get the tax bills out, tax bills to the printer sooner, so that that gives a little more lead time. But if there's a conflict, we'll keep it on the 19th. I think in the future, though,
The 17th.
the 17th, sorry, we should try to, I know in years past, we've had the BET meeting the night after the RTM meeting, or in some years past. So we should think about that for next year and when we're rescheduling the May BET meeting vis-a-vis the May RTM meeting. So we'll keep it for May 17th, and we'll get that information to you that evening and take it to the printer.
The only thing you might want to consider is that, we have until May 15th for the application for the senior tax relief. And so it's even harder to get numbers by the 12th.
Before then. Okay. That's a good consideration. Next month, sort of give you a preview, we've also received a request from the tax collector to review a notice that he would like to send out vis-a-vis taxes that are delinquent. So we're going to take that up next month. My sense is that we'll send it to the Budget Committee first for its review, and then send it to the full BET for its decision at the May 17th meeting. Also, and I don't exactly know the timing of this, there's been much publicity regarding the election of the BET. There have been numerous articles in the paper. There have been bloggers that have opined as to whether or not we're truly elected or not. I can assure you this, the amount of hours that we all spend, I think certainly we hold ourselves accountable to the citizens of this great community. And most recently, one of our former members opined on this topic as well, which I thought was a good article in terms of being balanced as to how we have operated over the years. That being said, this may be an issue that we decide to take up and yet again put to rest at least for another year or so before somebody else decides that they'd like to take up the issue of how the BET is elected. But if we do take it up, my plan would be is to hold what would be a public hearing 1 month and then vote on it the following month. But I'll certainly keep everybody apprised, and we'll see if we can yet again work through this issue. I'd have to dust off my version of the PowerPoint presentation that Mr. Krummick and I did several years ago and took to a variety of constituencies out there, including the League of Women Voters and some others. So if we can dust off that PowerPoint presentation, maybe the first place to start is just to distribute that and give everybody an opportunity to review that. But certainly we won't, our agendas are starting to fill up with some of these presentations. In fact, tonight we'll have City View, so we'll have to fit it in wherever it's most appropriate. Are there any other comments relative to the other officers' reports? Okay. Moving on now to old business. We've already taken care of municipal, the revaluation services contract, and we're on to Project Renew. I thought it was important that we get out Project Renew, one, for anybody who watches Channel 79. I will also comment on Project Renew tomorrow before WGCH. And I think it's important that the public understand the magnitude of this project and the importance of the upcoming votes that are going to be taken by the various governmental bodies in the town. If one wants to consider this a first read, so be it. I think it's more of a preliminary jumping off point. We've had several discussions and meetings over the past several months. This past month, we've had numerous meetings with Nathaniel Witherell. In fact, they came before the Budget Committee. And the expectation is that a approved CON is before us before the May meeting. I will reiterate that if it's not in place before the May meeting, then we'll put it off again until the June meeting or whenever the CON is approved. But my understanding is that it's in the works, and in fact, a proposed CON approval is in the works, and so we're optimistic that by May, we can have this all sorted out, or Nathaniel Witherell can have it all sorted out with the state and be ready to proceed at the May BET meeting, to then go before the RTM in June. There are some issues that still need to be, questions that need to be answered. I know of, other than the question that I asked Mr. Pellegrino relative to the building committee, Nathaniel Witherell has been asked to quantify the cost of closing the facility. I know you've answered that already once. I think it's imperative that we have a number that, while people might debate what that number is or whether or not it's the right number or the wrong number, it's the number I think that everyone can use and then can agree or disagree whether it's the right number. At that point, we also intend to go back to HDG for a few more items. One is a more defined or specific opinion relative to the impact of the healthcare legislation to Nathaniel Witherell. They provided us with a 10 or so page document that discusses generally how the healthcare legislation has affected the industry, but I think we want to drill that down a little bit and ask HDG to give us some more specifics relative to Nathaniel Witherell. And my understanding is Nathaniel Witherell did not receive a copy of that HDG follow-up. Is that correct? Okay, Peter, if you can make sure that that gets distributed to not only Nathaniel Witherell, but also the RTM, I'll just say liaisons, to make sure that they have the same information that we're working off of. We're also asking HDG to verify Nathaniel Witherell's cash flow statements. They've been revised since HDG was originally here and looked at those. We have to have a conversation about that relative to the CON. So before we actually ask them to review that, we should talk about that. And then we're also going to ask them, once Nathaniel Witherell quantifies the cost of closing the facility, we're going to ask them to verify that the cost of closure is in fact reasonable. And I'm choosing my words carefully with all the attorneys in the room. Certainly, I doubt they're going to say that that's the exact number, but hopefully they can at least indicate that under reasonable assumptions, it's a number that we can use or be comfortable with in a certain range. The Budget Committee has also asked for the various scenarios relative to the impact of Nathaniel Witherell as the current cash flows project. And when I say current cash flows, obviously there's going to be agreement and disagreement as to whether or not those cash flows are as accurate. I think from the Budget Committee standpoint, it's about in the $1.5 million range, but what the impact of that would be on the operating and capital budgets and or the increase of the mill rate, which was also discussed. And so what is the implication if in fact Project Renew is approved, whether one assumes that it's a break even or a fully payback, or whether there is some liability on a go-forward basis, or what people have referred to as a subsidy. So I think all of those questions will move forward, and then we'll be in a position to be able to vote on this in May. It'll go before the Budget Committee again, just like it did before. I think that's where, if there are still issues that are outstanding, those will get resolved there, in the hopes that when we meet in May, we're in a position to vote on it without having additional questions be raised. But if in fact they do come up, we'll have that other week again to raise those issues. You should have all received copies of communications from RTM members that are either pro or against Project Renew already. To the extent that I receive them, I forward them on to all of you. If you haven't received them, you have not? All right, we'll make sure that those get passed along.
I don't get it.
No, then they'll get passed on then.
They have the 22 pages of questions.
No, there have been two emails that should have been passed along.
My name is Kelly Williams, so just if you get that right from the last on the emails.
Kelly Williams?
Yeah, that's from the BET report, the 50th year anniversary.
Yes, okay.
Steve,
Maybe that's the problem, I'm not getting it.
I did, were the two that you're referring to, they were RTM members?
Yes,
Or
or
people who-
former RTM
Who were
members.
expressing their experiences at?
Yes,
Okay, I did receive those.
Jerry Isaacson?
You
yes.
don't get that.
Oh, yeah.
Right, yes, okay.
So any others? I also received a call from a current RTM member, in fact, the chairman of one of the committees, although I'm not sure that he was calling as chairman of one of the committees, expressing a viewpoint. And my suggestion to him was to send me an email, and I would make sure it would get distributed. So similarly, like I do with the budget material that I get, I then distribute it out so that everyone understands what people's viewpoints are on this. And with that in mind, are there, other than the questions that I asked here, what I'd like to do is wrap up sort of the question and answer portion in the next, let's say, week or so. If you have any major question that's out there, now would be a good time to provide it. If you don't have it tonight, then I would say that we need to at some point cut off the compilation of information and be prepared to vote on this. So I would ask, in the spirit of we're still trying to get some of these answered, if there are other major issues that you don't think I hit upon, that you either let me know now, or if not, by the end of the week. Is that fair? Okay. Ms. Spartan?
Are we proposing to vote on this with the various forms of complicated financing that have been discussed, or as a straight tax-exempt bond issued by the town of Greenwich?
I think at this point, you raise a good point, though, so thank you for raising that. We did have a conversation with the First Selectman's office. Nathaniel Witherell was present. Members of the RTM were present. The town administrator regarding this historic tax district credit. To say it's complex would, I think, be an understatement. In my understanding of the tax credit would be is that Nathaniel Witherell will not be in a position, the town will not be in a position to be able to say one way or the other before the May BET meeting. And in fact, it might not be available until the June RTM meeting, and in all likelihood, not until the end of the summer, if at the earliest. It's highly complex, highly specialized, and one of the considerations that this body might want to take up is whether or not this body feels comfortable in voting for Project Renew without that information. By all accounts, it's a potential credit of $6 to $8 million, although that's exclusive of any cost involved in this tax credit. And so as the cash flows start coming in, and that's why we're trying to get that information as soon as possible, I think it'll give this board an understanding that as of right now, I think you'd have to go under the assumption that those tax credits would not be available. But if someone's opinion was on this board that the tax credits would either make you approve it or disapprove it, then I think as a body we need to discuss that, because then what we need to convey to Nathaniel Witherell is that we're not ready to move forward, whether it happens in May, and this discussion probably won't happen until the May BET meeting. But I think if you have that concern, or that's going to be an issue for you individually, then I would ask that you convey that to me so that I can start having those conversations with Nathaniel Witherell about whether or not we're going to wait until those tax credit decision is made, because that will significantly put this project on hold for several months. And we just need to have that conversation. Ms. Barton and then Mr. Norton.
Just on that same point, one of the complexities in making that decision is that if we're going to issue Town of Greenwich tax-exempt bonds, then the entity that issues the bonds has to be by definition tax-exempt, whereas for historic tax credits, the issuing entity has to be a taxable entity. So there's going to be a complicated legal and finance question that has not yet been answered as to what the comparison is between these two financings. If we think we can't be ready, or it's too complicated for easy comprehension, then we may well be better off just going with general tax-exempt bonds issued by the town of Greenwich, which is what the plan had always been, in which event, one of the things that has to be done is to get bond counsel to look at these resolutions and sort out the question of what to do with the prior funding for Nathaniel Witherall that's folded into these assumptions. So neither financing is simple right now. And if we're going to vote on either of them in May, something definitive has to be presented, hopefully with the approval of bond counsel.
I added to my list, and I was mistaken. I should have had it in the very beginning. The question of prior funding was a question that we're asking Nathaniel Witherall to, and the Finance Department to look into and quantify and elaborate on as to where that, how much money was spent, where that money is, and how that affects the proposed bonding resolution. So thank you for also bringing up that item. That's on a list of sort of the major items that needs to be discussed and reported on. Mr. Norton and then Mr. Pellegrino.
Mr. Chairman, in relation to the historic district tax credit, is there a time constraint with it, either implicit or implied in that credit?
Before the bonds have to be issued, and if I'm misstating anything, Mr. Mynarski will let me know. I believe they have to be issued before the end of the year, calendar year.
There is a time constraint, and it's the next 7 months, roughly.
That's right. Mr. Pellegrino.
Mr. Chairman, just for purposes of clarity and having expectations on this side of the table and that side, can you just go back to your first comment, which was an approved con before the May meeting? I just want to make sure we're clear on that. Are we talking about a signed document with the state of Connecticut? Are we talking about a proposal from the state of Connecticut to us? What exactly should we expect to have before we move forward with the May meeting?
Well, I think in the best case scenario, it's an approved CON issued by the state. If that in fact isn't there, then at least it's a proposal that is at a threshold that everyone can agree to, or at least we understand that that's the minimum that's going to be provided by the state, and it's not going to go below that threshold. So I think it's to be determined. Obviously, I think we'd all like to see a signed off CON. Obviously, that's a major component as to what the potential liability is for the town on a go-forward basis.
Okay, thank you.
I just add one. I think that has to be something in writing, as opposed to an oral representation.
I agree. Whatever it is needs to be in writing. Further discussion points? Yes, Mr. Huffman.
Just to clarify, in my experience, it would be extremely unusual to issue bonds, waiting to adopt the bond resolution prior to the receipt of a certificate of need.
That's always been the expectation before voting on this, so. Ms. Spartan?
Sorry, one more. Late this afternoon, as I was running out of the house, the last thing I did was to print out a bunch of emails that came in on the cogen facility, which I haven't had a chance to read. I will do so, but can someone enlighten me as to what this is all about?
They're here.
I know, they're here, and I had a copy, and I started to skim it, but it's, 40 pages of stuff.
I think it was a follow-up to what was the discussion at the Budget Committee meeting to get some more information as to whether or not those costs are contained in Project Renew. And I think that's going to be a further follow-up by the Budget Committee. And this is, Mr. Mynarski received the information, and in the theory that getting you the information as soon as possible with this is more important than going through an explanation as to why this information is coming. So
this will go to the Budget Committee in May before it comes?
That's right.
Okay, thank you.
That's right. Further items or discussion points on this topic? So once again, just to tee it up, the expectation is that the questions that have been laid out tonight will be answered well in advance of the May meeting. There'll be a discussion at that time with a resolution that has been approved of by bond counsel with a certificate of need in hand for us to take up. And with relative to the issue of historic tax credits, that will be taken up along the way, and if things change, we'll certainly convey that to Nathaniel Witherell. But as of right now, that's where we're headed. Ms. Tarkington.
Yes, Mr. Chairman, are there any plans that are available for the public to see in this interim in case they want to see what is going to be done at Nathaniel Witherell? I mean, does Nathaniel Witherell have them up in boards at Witherell, or will they be posted in the front hall the way, say, the public safety building model was? I mean, is there anything for the public to see before we vote, just in case they want to?
Well, I know the Finance Department has a set. The First Selectman's Office gave me a set. In fact, I think we discussed that at one of our special project team meetings. And so if any BET member wishes to review those, there's a set of documents in the Finance Department for Project Renew.
Well, no, I meant in terms of the public, since we're now going through our approval process. I mean, will they be up on an easel at Witherell or anything like that?
Mr. Ormsby, Chairman of Nathaniel Witherell.
Ms. Tarkington, we have architect's renderings of the proposed Project Renew. We've got a PowerPoint presentation we've done for a small group of the BET, yourself included. On April 28th, we are meeting with a group of representatives from the RTM to go through that same process, and we're prepared to make those available in whatever venue and whatever form we think would be useful. We understand we've got an education process to go through, not only with this organization, but with the RTM. Those materials are available, and any suggestions you've got about organizing group inspection of those would be welcome. Mr. Walpole, I might just mention one other thing.
If you can just come up, we can hear you, but I saw the wizard in the closet who suggested that you come to the mic.
That's the wizard?
I might just mention, because I have seen some reservations and some blank stares on some of your colleagues' faces, we have a specific written proposal from the state of Connecticut for a certificate of need. What we are discussing with them is the amount of the fair rent adjustment that will be included in that. They have proposed a number. We are mildly disappointed with that. We have been told in discussions with the staff as recently as this morning that they would welcome a counter proposal. We're in the process of negotiating that number. That obviously is the most important part of the certificate of need, but there is a written proposed certificate of need that has been issued by the state of Connecticut.
Thank you. Wow, no, now there's questions. That's good. Mr. Finger?
The initial feedback that you have on the fair rental value, is that something that was received subsequent to the Budget Committee meeting last week?
Yes, we received this morning.
Thank you.
Mr. Simon?
So I was looking at this over this weekend. I was looking at the website, and I can see, I can determine from the website, there's a calculation that tells you the fair rental value for $25 million at the current rate of interest, somewhere between $1.5 and $1.6 million. But I'm not sure, I never quite understood how you got that number and how that went into the HDG model of 800,000. And what was, and you don't have to answer that tonight, but I would like to be able to understand how you take the transition from the state fair rental value and the HDG number and how it gets applied. So that would be a question I have, because I could never quite figure this out.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Kelly?
Mr. Ormsby just mentioned a PowerPoint. If there's certain documents or a PowerPoint that we should look at, I'd certainly be willing to look at it. Not come to a location to look at it, but if you want to send it to me, I'll review it.
Further discussion? Okay, yes, Mr. Bankson.
Knowing how long it takes things to get done at HDG, I would encourage you to get to them very quickly and put them right. Otherwise, you're going to miss my guess.
Yeah, the concern that I have, though, just so you know, is that depending on the CON and any fluctuation in that number, may change their verification of the cash flow needs. So,
But they can get going on questions like the impact of legislative changes.
without a doubt, they've already been asked those.
Should probably say certificate of need.
Further follow-up, yes?
Just for the audience, you might say what the CO.
Oh, the certificate of need?
Is, yeah.
It's the document that's presented to the state for approval of this project, and it's reimbursement by the state through reimbursement rates.
We just get caught up in the acronyms all the time.
Fair enough. Further discussion? Very well, to be continued at our May meeting. Item 10 now comes before us. The first is the City View presentation by the town administrator, John Crary. I'll let John introduce whoever he's.
Assisted by Katie Blankley, who's our Deputy Director of Planning and Zoning. She's going to do a little demonstration, give you a little idea how it looks actually on our computers.
Right.
I'll give her a minute to set up.
Well, thank you for attending this evening. I know we had a preliminary conversation, very brief, last month. And Katie, thank you for doing this.
This software package has been something that's been underway for almost 10 years. It's, and of course, I've only been here about 3, so I didn't participate in all of that period. But I understand from talking to various department heads who have participated in it that the need for a common database to track and record all actions that involve a particular property within the town has been an area of concern for many years. Such a database will include all permits, zoning approvals, construction, and any other condition or limitations that may be imposed by any agency on a parcel by one of the many bodies that have such authority. This includes planning and zoning, the building division of public works, other public works divisions that oversee roads and the sewers, the health department, the fire marshal, inland wetlands, and the watercourses commission. The particular software program will need to be able to track everything that happens on a property and allow all of the town departmental users to be aware of these actions and or limitations. The town has over 22,000 parcels, and such a software package will permit all land use or based agencies to work off a common database. At the time these discussions were taking place, the only department with the software that met their needs was the building department in DPW. All other departments were working off Access or Excel spreadsheets or paper ledger forms that were not integrated with one another, and for the most part were maintained in-house. Whenever an applicant wanted to make a change at his or her property, it meant numerous stops at the various departments. Similarly, the departments had limited or no knowledge of what what their counterparts were doing or had done with respect to a particular property. In 2006, a request for proposal was prepared by the IT department that incorporated all of the requirements of the involved agencies. After a lengthy review process, the City View software, which is produced by a company called Municipal Software, was selected as best meeting the needs of the town. At the time of the award in August 2007, the cost of this software contract was $597,000. Peter Tessie appointed an implementation committee in December of 2007 to work towards the integration of this software into our system. I was appointed chair of the steering committee, and since that time, we have met monthly or in many cases bi-weekly to bring the software to an active status. One of the first problems we experienced was the need to identify the business practices of each of the departments to assure that the software would replicate how we actually operate. We spent days reviewing in detail exactly how applications are or should be received and what steps need to be completed before applications go forward. We needed to know what information was required and by whom to assure that software would actually track how we actually do business. This has led to a better understanding of of what each of the departments or divisions does and what is important to them. One of the goals of the new software is to eliminate information being kept within the proverbial silos. Due to our form of government with our many checks and balances, the effort to implement this software into our business model has enabled us to create better working environment from the many departments who are involved. While not perfect, there is now in place a framework for solving problems and the potential for real teamwork on land use issues. Once we completed this effort to chart our business practices, the software was modified to reflect how Greenwich does business. Revised versions of the CityView program was sent to us, and of course we tested it and checked and identified any problems that were present. Again, revised versions were prepared, and after most problems were resolved, we held a 2-week training program which began for the many staff that are using this software, and it began on March 13th and continued to March 26th. As you know, that was the height of our storm that knocked out over 700 trees in the town and left much of the town without electricity. Needless to say, training programs was disrupted, but we did push through, and most people received the training that they needed in order to proceed with implementation. Once we completed the training program, we decided we would go live on Monday, April 12th, last Monday, and we did so. We now have a full week of experience with the software, and while there have been some problems, I think everyone is satisfied that our first week was a success. Our plan going forward is to continue to learn the nuances and capabilities of the software and attempt to reach a level of staff comfort with this new tool. As I said, we've only had a week, and Katie is one of our key people in terms of implementing the software. Planning and zoning is extremely excited about doing this, and I've asked Katie to just give us a quick 5 minutes just to show you a little bit of what it can do, and it won't be everything, and it certainly is only 1 week's worth of experience, but I'll turn it over to Katie.
Thank you. Well, it tests my technological skills and see what I can get this for.
Actually, can I just? Oh, hi, I think I'm just gonna plug this in. If this works, we should be good.
Nope. Try count 2. I think do your desktop.
Should I try these two on the bottom?
That's right. Excuse me. Sorry.
Jamie, thank you.
TV.
Let's see. A lot of power in this room. Good login.
sorry that I'm going to have to have my back to you, but I don't think I can do both. Okay. So as John said, we are very excited in planning and zoning for this system, very excited. When I first started in the town 10 years ago, we maintained 4 redundant databases, and then when we implemented the land use permit tracking system, which is an access database, that added the 5th. So now we are in CityView, and we're going to have one database. So to us, the primary asset to this system is the efficiency it's going to afford our department. Not only will we be able to look at all of our own systems in here, but we'll now be able to look at the other departments' permits and applications. That's something that we have not been able to do before. After we get our feet a little bit more wet, something that we'll be able to give the public also. So the public will no longer have to go from department to department and learn 5 different database systems. They'll be able to go into one centralized system, plug in an address, see all of the permits and applications associated with those addresses and the issues associated with them, who is involved with them, the status of each of those permits. So right there is going to be a huge increase in our efficiency as a town. This is what it looks like when you first get onto the system. These things over here are called catalogs. This is the planning catalog. This is the planning application. These things are called binders. And each of those binders you have sheets. So these search capabilities are incredibly powerful. As John mentioned, we're all still learning this together, and as we go forward, more and more things we realize are becoming things that we can search on and do. We have a new numbering system, so each department has their own preface. Ours is PLPZ, and each department starts with the year and then a sequential numbering system. So what I'm doing right now is I'm just using the navigation to see how many applications we have pending. So since April 12th, these are the applications that have been submitted to planning and zoning alone. So what happens when you click on one of these is you'll see below in the planning application area that becomes available, and you can see what each of these is for and who's the planner associated with it. This one here I happen to know is assigned to me, number 12. This is on Butler Street, and each of these sheets gives additional information about the application. So here's just the application setup. That. So this is the application details. So this particular application is a coastal area management application that is administrative. And these are their timelines associated with it down here. We can look at the contacts. We can add in the property owner, the agent. We can determine if it's on a hearing. This particular one's an administrative one, so it's not associated with a hearing. The fees are all nicely outlined, whether or not they've paid. We can attach documents. We've have several different options that we have under here: the application form, the agenda, the approved map. And this is particularly useful in terms of efficiency because in the past when somebody calls and wants to know about the application, we have to get up off of our chairs, go over to the filing cabinet, find out, perhaps look into the cards, find the number associated with that application, which doesn't seem like a big deal, but when you do this 5, 10, 15, 20 times a day, that actually adds up to a lot of wasted time, especially if then you have to go to another department to find out the status of that permit. So everything will be in this centralized location. For an example, if I'm not sure actually if this computer has a PDF, but this is the application form right there, so we can see what that looks like on this particular application. So just having this access at our fingertips like that is really powerful. As I mentioned, this application was assigned to me. The other powerful thing about CityView from an internal basis is that each of the triggers in here are associated with an activity. So these are all of the activities that I have to do. Some of these have to do with hearings, some of them have to do with the applications. On this particular one, I'll have to render a decision by 6/24. That's the timelines associated per state statute. So that's something that's built into the system. That's going to be very helpful to us. Yes. But yes, it will. Yeah, it's the kind of thing where you go in there every day, say, what do I have to do today? And it will give you that information. Now, the other great thing about the City View is it's integrated with our GIS system. So when we go on to property information onto this binder, these are all the tabs here. There's property information that is associated with each application. So if I just come back here, let me click on this. So all of this information, the parcel number, the parcel status, the legal description, that has been pulled from our GIS system. So all of that attribute information associated with the parcel is now in the City View system. This is not only powerful in terms of an integrated system, but it also allows us to now search using a mapping, using a spatial search, which is something we haven't been able to do before. So. For some reason, my map is not showing up over here. I apologize. Usually there's a map, which doesn't seem to be here at the moment, so I'm going to skip that part. Cashiering, something I will admit I am not too keyed into. That's not really my forte, but I thought you might be interested to see what kinds of reports we could do. So let's put in the 12th when we started. So these are all the, this particular report is the payment details. So what it's going to be doing is going out to all of the fees that were entered from all of the departments and putting it into this report for this time period. As you can see, it's taking a while, so we've actually received a lot of money during the last week from all the different departments, something I think you'd be very pleased with.
Now, you're not going back and inputting any applications prior to April 12th? Is that correct?
That's a very good question. In planning and zoning, we have done that. It's called our legacy data. So from all of those disparate databases that I was talking about, we put them all into, as best as we could, into the City View system. We have the capability to go back and keep amending as time goes on to, as you know, when we have redundancy, there's error. So we have the capability to amend that. The other very important thing about this is that we will be able to associate each one of those previous applications with the parcel that it is associated with, which is going to be fantastic because when you click on a particular parcel, now not only the new applications submitted after April 12th, but all of the previous applications will also be in there. The building department, because of some logistical issues, did not do that with their permit. So April 12, 2010 will be on City View for the building department and some of the other departments, and going back in time will be on the Cornerstone system. So there's 15 pages that were generated. And as you can see, just move this over a little bit. These are all of the different departments and the fees associated with those departments. In this property information area where I was before, I can click on this related items button for that 25 Butler Street, which is that coastal administrative application I was on before. And you can see that here's the planning and zoning pending application. This one right above it is the inland wetlands application. So those are the two applications that have been submitted since April 12th on this particular address. When they submit for their permit to the building department, that will also become available down here. So that's really going to be a great thing going forward. And I apologize why this, I've never seen the map not show up, which makes me think that I'm just not looking at it.
Is this web-based or do we own?
Web-based.
It is web-based. And the information is backup.
It's on a server in our building.
Okay.
So we have our own server to speed it up, but it's still web-based.
And there's a redundancy somewhere else in some
Because
location.
then you withdraw for backup.
Okay.
Daily. There's a GIS map, but I think that's what's done right.
Yeah, I'm trying to find the map. It's usually right here. I'm not sure.
Show what we have on GIS, which is the map of the particular property. So if you're sitting in your office and you want to look at it, you want to look at the map. So.
Has the assessor's office been part of the training of this yet?
And as far as I know, no. I don't think they've been involved in some of the discussions, but I don't think they were at any training, were they? You remember, Katie? I think it was
They did talk about going to training and how important the system was going to be to them because of all the data and all the data that they have to collect on building permits and so on.
So I never went to any of the trainings, so I have no idea who was there.
I'm not sure if they were trained, but we've met with them actually extensively because this is now going to be an address system. Prior to this date, every department could essentially enter whatever address they wanted to. We have addresses in planning and zoning, we're just as guilty as the other departments, such as Conyers Farm Gatehouse. I mean, that's clearly not an address. The benefit of this system is we will now have the ability to standardize all departments. There'll be one address system, and planning and zoning per the charter is responsible for that. So that's another thing that we're particularly happy about because it got messy. And as you know, with that's an issue for public safety also. So now being able to have one address system that each department can know that is consistent, is accurate, is going to be great. A couple of years down the road, that's not an easy task, but as we iron things out, that's going to be a big change also.
How is this system going to interact with records that already exist with regard to things like where sewer lines are, where gas lines are, other things? Because I've understood that some projects that have occurred in the last couple of years, there have been real issues about what our records show and who are actually getting the problems as far as being able to make connections.
Well, because this is a centralized system, everything will be in one place. And as I showed you, you can attach certain maps and documents into the system. And eventually we'll be marrying this system with the new the digital document project that we're going forward with also. So it will all be centralized. And
it'll show those as permitted and then actually as installed.
correct. Yes. Yeah, in here you can see what stage of the game each application is at. I can only speak for planning and zoning. I'm not sure of the ins and outs of how the sewer department is run to that level of accuracy. But in planning and zoning, we can tell when an application is pending before the commission, if it's an administrative application, if they've received their commission approval, if they're going for their building permit, if they have a CO. And that kind of thing is important information for the other departments to know where we are, because we don't want the building department, for an example, to issue a certificate of occupancy if certain conditions haven't been met by our department, and likewise by the other departments. So we don't want departments signing off on applications unless everybody is ready for that to happen. So this is going to allow us to have that communication that has been lacking in the past.
This is going to take months for everybody to get comfortable with using it. Then after that's done, it'll take years to get the data really good. And then as we learn, we're going to figure out all sorts of other capabilities with this. As Katie mentioned, we're doing this document imaging program that we've been going on for about 3 months. We got about 6 more months to go. We're going to integrate that, plus the GIS. All these things are going to tie together. We're going to have some pretty neat stuff when we get all done.
Absolutely.
From a consumer standpoint, I mean, Katie and John are speaking to this from a standpoint of how much more efficiently it helps their departments work. But from the consumer standpoint, I can tell you that what we've had has been very, very chaotic. That you go over and look at building department records, and their records are only by name of owner. And unless you have the name of every single owner, you're missing what projects may have done on the property. Then you walk across the corridor, you go to environmental health, and you can't find any record whatsoever on the development of a septic system that you know is already at the property. You go over to planning and zoning, and they're dealing with a property address, but you go over to wetlands and they know it by a different property address. You begin to review the files, and it's a little hard to understand from old files sometimes exactly what level of success and completion took place, and somehow to have this defined integration and these specific parameters from a consumer standpoint is going to make it a ton better. And it's always been my impression as a practicing lawyer how this chaos had sort of underserved our citizenry, and I think you've grabbed by the tail here that problem, and you're in the path to resolving it, and I think that really deserves kudos.
It's going to take a while, but I think
Yes, it is. And that's exactly why we're so excited. You just said it in a nutshell.
This is something that is internal for the departments to use. It's not something that the public...
It'll be on the web eventually.
It will be eventually.
Yeah, we want to get all of the bugs out of it and everybody comfortable. Then we're going to put it on the web.
So if a member of the public anytime soon wanted to get a report on a particular property and find out everything about that property...
It'll be a couple of months before I think that'll actually happen, but it will happen. It won't be as detailed as what we'll have access to, but it will have access to a lot of information, and you'll be able to do things on the web that now you have to physically come over here from.
I would just caution you with respect to that, without prejudging it. I just know what this body went through in the information that was going to be put on. And so I submit to you that maybe a public hearing or something before that goes live would be beneficial, because the citizens of Greenwich like to keep their information, not necessarily not public, but where someone has to come to town hall to access it. So I just use those words of caution. Let me just say that this has been in the works for a while. We had a special project team last couple years on this topic. This is the first step. The goal here is to invite you back in a year from now, see how the town has handled City View, what are the pros, the cons, the nuances of it, and maybe at that time you can run us through an example of somebody who came in and how it helped in a particular scenario. So in the back of your mind, maybe keep in mind, figure out which example you'll want to use over the next year or so, to then come back in April to show us, and I think that would be helpful.
It will definitely have the map then.
Okay. Good. Well, thank you very much.
Thank you.
Mr. Mynarski, then, if you can make sure that that's calendared for April of 2011 City View presentation, that would be helpful. Because I'll forget if you don't help me remember, so.
Peter's like, I got it.
Okay. The last item of the evening is the review and approval of resolution concerning OPEB investment policy statement. And with that, I turn it over to Mr. Pellegrino, the chairman of the OPEB ad hoc committee.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. By way of background, I'd like to share the following with you. When I was given this assignment, I stepped back and I looked at the documents that governed OPEB. In doing so, what I came across was essentially 4 separate documents drafted at different points in time, and not necessarily talking to each other. So my motivation has been to step back, try to pull together into one document an investment policy guideline statement, and really for a couple of purposes. One is, hopefully, it will help in terms of the management of the funds in OPEB, and if we can manage them even better or more efficiently with even less risk, then that's a benefit to the town, and it's a benefit to all the taxpayers. So that's my motivation and my driving force here. What I did was I took examples that were current, state-of-the-art from various consulting firms, looked over about not quite a dozen of them. I also looked at the existing investment policy statement for our retirement board, and I culled from them what I thought were the best features and language to express in plain English how we should be thinking about investing funds. This draft that you have before you is the work of the members of the board of OPEB, input from the Investment Advisory Committee, and also other members of our board here who have taken the time to look at it and comment on it. If you'd like, Mr. Chairman, I could go through a couple of the key provisions here, or I could step back and suggest that since this is a first reading, if there are questions, I'd certainly entertain them. Certainly would welcome your input, thoughts, comments, and if they could be directed perhaps to Mr. Mynarski. We will meet, OPEB will meet again next month, I believe on the 13th. If we have comments before then, we'll certainly try to incorporate them in the next revision. And I think for purposes of time right now, I'll pause to see, Mr. Chairman, if you have any questions or if any other members of the board would like to raise any questions.
So this came before us. It became apparent once it was issued. One, it's not your run-of-the-mill resolution that we adopt normally, the one paragraph or a few whereas clauses and then an adoption. It's pretty meaty and substantive. It also begins to bring to closure the OPEB ad hoc committee and sets us on a path of, I think, what hopefully is an institutionalized process for the OPEB fund and its management. And so I don't think that it was wise to just bring this forward to a vote, give all the BET members a chance to digest it, although it has been reviewed by, I believe, close to 5 or 6 of you already through the various committees. But for all of us who are not on those committees, I think that it's important that we look at it this month and that we vote on it next month. So in that light, I think certainly the OPEB ad hoc committee is going to meet, as indicated, May 13th or so. I know that the Investment Advisory Committee is not scheduled to meet until June. However, if they decide to take this matter up as well based on some of the comments by fellow BET members, then they may decide to meet as well. But that the hope would be that we can also take this up in May for adoption. And with that said, if there are questions this evening that one wishes to make, then it's perfectly acceptable and I think warranted to raise those questions now. If not, say by next Friday, which would be April 30th? April 30th. Or thereabouts, next Friday? Is that right? Anybody who has a calendar? April 30th, okay. So if not questions by April 30th, and that way these either one or two committees can then take those comments and or questions under advisement. I will say that part of the discussion already relates to delegation of authority of the BET, whether it's to the Investment Advisory Committee and or to the trust. And there are some other questions regarding just how often the trust would meet and things of that nature. So those discussions are already in the works, but if you want to weigh in, please forward your comments to Peter Mynarski, who will then forward them on to the two committees. Further discussion, Mr. Simon.
The ad hoc committee has not met for quite a while, and this recommendation is really coming from the Investment Advisory Committee. So, I mean, at this point, it's not clear that it would serve any purpose for the ad hoc committee to start meeting again, and maybe that we should just delegate this entire process to the Investment Advisory Committee. What's meeting is the OPEB board, or else we can. I mean, it's like we haven't done anything in this.
Well, at some point, though, that committee needs to wrap it up, and this is one aspect of wrapping up their work, because we want to close the loop on that ad hoc committee, and then pass the torch over to just the trust.
So maybe we should have one more meeting, discuss this policy, make sure everybody agrees on the way in which it's done, discuss again. Because I think once you agree on this policy, how often the board meets, and what the board's responsibilities are, that makes it a lot simpler to then find and recommend a process for people to serve on the board.
Right, which will go through the Investment Advisory Committee. So I think that's right. I think I just want to combine all of these things, however, all of these issues and all of these items, and bring some closure to the ad hoc committee, and then move it forward that way.
Excellent.
Sure, Mr. Finger first, and then Mr. Pellegrino.
I believe Mr. Pellegrino is the chair of both the OPEB ad hoc and investment advisory committee, so it's his decision, but it might be worthwhile to have a joint investment advisory committee meeting and OPEB ad hoc.
If I may respond,
sure.
I absolutely would welcome that. I think the more people we can get around the table to hammer this out, we'll achieve our objective, which is to reach an agreement and move forward.
Since there's 3 overlapping members on
I think there's only one non-member.
Mr. Chairman, if I may
Yes, sure.
make another comment. In addition to helping the board of the OPEB trust go forward in terms of its recommendations and advice for investments, this is a very helpful document to give to any prospective member of the town who's interested in serving on the board. It really helps them understand what the objectives are how to go about doing it, what the asset classes are or the subclasses are that they could consider investing in.
Further discussion on this point? So I once again get your comments in by next Friday, if you have any. If not, the committee of 2 or 3 will meet.
Mr. Chair?
Yes, Mr. Norton.
Has it been suggested to have a meeting of the OPEB ad hoc committee, which, was that a suggestion, or was it the intent to follow through on making a recommendation that that committee meets?
Mr. Pellegrino.
It's my understanding that Mr. Finger suggested we have members of the OPEB ad hoc committee meet along with the investment advisory committee. And that would seem to cover all members of the board who are involved in the investment process.
I believe there are 5 members who represent those 2 committees, 4 representing one committee and 1 other individual. And is that recommendation to meet before the OPEB Trust Board meets again? Or subsequent to that?
Mr. Norton, I don't think it needs to meet before the OPEB Trust. I think the OPEB Trust can continue to meet and work on discussions. But I do think we should meet before the next scheduled BET meeting so that we can get this on next month's agenda and have it dispatched.
Well, where I'm going with this is the fact that I believe the OPEB Trust is scheduled to meet on the 13th of May. The full BET meets 6 days later.
4 days later.
No, I think we've 17th, right, 4 days later. So how can we do all of...
I would just suggest, let's defer this for discussion now, and let's just work on this tomorrow in terms of our schedules and pull people together. Does that, Mr. Kelly, would you agree with that? Okay. Thank you. Please?
Hearing none, is there a motion to adjourn?
Yes.
Thank you. All right.
Thank you.